Hello NDE narrator, my name is Abdul-Aziz, sending this urgent mail to you from France. I'm a man who has lived two different lives. I was born in Syria, in the city of Aleppo, where my earliest memories are filled with the sound of the call to prayer echoing across the rooftops, the crowded markets full of spices and voices, and the warmth of my family gathered together each evening. I grew up in a household where Allah was always at the center. My father was not an imam, but he was respected in our neighborhood as a man of knowledge who taught Quran to children in the evenings. My mother was a kind woman who worked hard to take care of us, and together they gave me and my siblings a life that felt secure and steady. Childhood in Aleppo was not wealthy, but it was full of traditions that shaped who I became. Life in Syria before the war felt simple but meaningful. I remember playing football in the narrow streets with other boys, barefoot and laughing until the call to prayer reminded us it was time to return home. My father often told me stories about the greatness of Islam, about the history of our people, and about the duty to preserve our faith in every land. As a child, I believed these words deeply because they came from a man I respected. I loved walking with him to the mosque on Fridays, seeing the rows of men bowing and listening carefully to the imam's sermon. School was not easy, but I was a determined boy. I enjoyed reading, especially stories of Islamic scholars, and my teachers always encouraged me to pursue knowledge. Looking back, those early years gave me a strong foundation of faith, family values, and cultural pride. I never imagined how quickly that foundation would be shaken. Everything changed when the war erupted in Syria. I was about 20 years old when the conflict reached our city, and suddenly the streets I once played in became dangerous battlegrounds. The sounds of laughter and prayer were replaced by bombs, gunfire, and cries of fear. Families that had lived side by side for generations began to scatter. Our neighbors left their homes overnight, and buildings that once stood tall crumbled into piles of dust and broken stones. My parents tried to remain strong, but I could see the worry in their eyes. Each day we wondered if we would live to see the next. Food became scarce, businesses closed, and schools were no longer safe. The Aleppo I had known and loved was disappearing before my eyes, and I realized that if I stayed, my future would be swallowed by violence. Leaving Syria was the hardest decision I ever made. I loved my country, my family, and the memories that tied me to its soil, but the war made survival impossible. At night, I would lie awake listening to the distant explosions, thinking about what my life could become if I found a way out. My parents encouraged me to go, even though it broke their hearts. My mother hugged me tightly, whispering prayers for my safety, while my father reminded me to hold on to Islam wherever I went. With only a small bag of belongings and the little money we could gather, I set out on a journey that would change everything. I left Syria at the age of 20, with no clear destination other than survival, and I carried the weight of leaving my family behind in the middle of chaos. When I arrived in France, I felt both relief and fear. Relief because I was far from the bombs and the sound of war, and fear because I had entered a country where I was a stranger in every sense. I did not speak French well, I had no friends, and I had no one to guide me through this new life. Paris was beautiful, but for me it was overwhelming. The tall buildings, the fast trains, and the unfamiliar faces made me feel small and invisible. I rented a small room in a poor neighborhood where many other immigrants lived. The streets were filled with languages from across the world, but inside my heart, I carried loneliness and longing for home. I often thought about my parents and my siblings, wondering if they were still alive, and those thoughts both strengthened and weakened me. Adapting to life in France was a struggle I will never forget. Every day brought challenges that tested my patience and my will to survive. I had to learn a new language, adjust to new laws, and navigate a culture that was so different from what I had known. In Syria, life was centered around community and faith, but in France, I felt people lived more for themselves. At first, I worked small jobs washing dishes and cleaning, just to have enough money to pay rent and eat. The long hours left me exhausted, but I reminded myself that this was the price of starting over. Sometimes I faced discrimination, people looking at me suspiciously when they heard my accent or saw my beard. These experiences hurt, but they also pushed me to work harder, to prove that I could make something of myself in this foreign land. One of the turning points in my life was when I decided to open a small restaurant. Food had always been a part of my upbringing in Aleppo, where my mother cooked meals that brought people together. I wanted to recreate that feeling even in a foreign country. I started with little, just a small space, some secondhand furniture, and recipes that reminded me of home. At first, the customers were few, mostly immigrants who missed the taste of Syrian food. But slowly word began to spread. People from different backgrounds came to try the kebabs, falafel, and shawarma I prepared. They liked the authenticity, the flavors, and the warmth of the place. I worked from morning until midnight, pouring every bit of energy into the restaurant. The business grew faster than I expected, and within a few years I became known in the neighborhood. People recognized me as the young Syrian who served food with both passion and humility. The restaurant became more than a place to eat. It became a gathering point for Muslims in the community. They came not only for food but also for conversation, for discussions about faith, and for a sense of belonging. For me, it was a dream come true. From a lonely immigrant struggling to survive, I had become a respected business owner with influence and recognition. The money I earned gave me security, but even more, it gave me confidence. I felt that I was finally building a future in Europe, one that could not be taken away easily. As I reflect on those years, I see them as the foundation of the man I became. The struggles of leaving Syria, the loneliness of arriving in France, and the determination to build a business from nothing shaped me into someone strong and ambitious. My restaurant was not just about food, it was about identity, survival, and pride. I held on to the teachings of Islam through it all, believing that Allah had guided me to this point. I thought I had found my place in Europe, but what I did not realize then was that this success would open doors to a new and dangerous path. For now, however, my story was one of survival, growth, and the beginning of a journey that would take me far beyond the walls of my restaurant. As the years passed, my restaurant continued to grow, and with it came recognition that I never imagined for myself. What began as a small kitchen with only a handful of tables became a thriving place where people waited in long lines for meals. I became known not only in the neighborhood but in other parts of Paris as well. Newspapers occasionally wrote about immigrants who had built successful businesses, and my name appeared in one of those articles. For me, it was more than just money, it was influence. Suddenly, I was no longer the lonely young man who had once struggled to find work washing dishes. I was a respected member of the community, and people treated me with admiration. The income gave me comfort, but the respect gave me pride, and that pride pushed me to think of how I could do more than just serve food. The wealth from the restaurant gave me the ability to live well. I moved into a bigger apartment, bought a better car, and sent money back to my family in Syria. Every time I spoke with my parents, I could hear the relief in their voices, knowing that at least one of their children was safe and prospering. Among my fellow Muslims in Paris, I became a role model of sorts. Many young men who had also fled the war looked at me with admiration. They saw in me a reflection of what was possible when one combined hard work with faith in Allah. This recognition began to open doors I had not expected. Invitations came to attend community meetings, cultural events, and gatherings in mosques where my presence was requested not as a worker, but as someone with influence. The boy who once escaped the ruins of Aleppo had now become a man of standing in France. It was during this time of success that I first heard about the European Institute of Human Sciences, known as IESH. Some of the men in the mosque told me about it, describing it as a place where Muslims could receive proper Islamic education, train as leaders, and strengthen their knowledge of religion. The institute, founded in 1990, was located in Château Chinon, in the Burgundy region of France. They said it was dedicated to training imams and Muslim leaders who would guide communities across Europe. The idea fascinated me. I had always respected the imams who led us in prayer, and deep inside, I carried the voice of my father reminding me that knowledge was the foundation of strength. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the next step for me. Running a business gave me influence, but I realized that if I gained formal religious training, I could use my voice to do even more. Enrolling at IESH was not an easy decision, because it meant dividing my time between business and study. Yet I felt strongly that Allah had blessed me with success not just for myself, but to support the cause of Islam. I applied and was accepted into their program, and the day I stepped into the institute, I felt like I was entering a new chapter of my life. The campus was small compared to major universities, but it carried an atmosphere of discipline and purpose. Students came from different parts of Europe and even beyond, all united by a desire to deepen their Islamic knowledge. For me, it was inspiring to be surrounded by people who were not just trying to survive, but to shape the future of Muslims in Europe. I felt I had found my place among people who understood both my struggles and my ambitions. The training at IESH was intense and structured. We studied Quran, Hadith, Islamic jurisprudence, and the history of Muslim civilizations. For the first time, I had access to scholars who explained the depth of Sharia law and the importance of preserving Islamic values in secular societies. We had classes not only on religious texts but also on human sciences, leadership, and community management. The Institute's vision was clear: to equip Muslims in Europe with leaders who could represent them with confidence. I soaked up every lesson like a sponge, driven by a hunger to become more than just a businessman. I wanted to be someone whose voice carried weight in matters of faith and society. The discipline reminded me of my father's teachings, but here it was broader, sharper, and more strategic. What struck me most was the emphasis on leadership. Our instructors did not only want us to memorize scripture, they wanted us to learn how to influence communities, how to speak with authority, and how to defend Islamic positions in public debates. They reminded us that Europe was becoming a battleground of ideas, where Islam was often misunderstood or opposed. It was our duty, they said, to stand strong and unapologetic. Their words lit a fire in me. I began to see myself not just as a student, but as a soldier in a larger struggle to ensure that Islam would not only survive in Europe but thrive. My confidence grew as I learned to debate, to give speeches, and to organize community projects. The shy young man who had once been overwhelmed by Paris was gone. In his place stood someone bold and determined. The more I studied, the more stubborn I became in my convictions. I saw secular laws as temporary and flawed, compared to the eternal truth of Sharia. My professors emphasized that Muslims in Europe must not dilute their faith to blend in, but instead must preserve their identity and push for recognition. I began to believe it was my responsibility to carry this mission forward. The restaurant gave me the resources, but the institute gave me the ideology. Together, they turned me into a man who no longer simply lived in Europe but wanted to shape it. I was convinced that Allah had brought me this far not for personal comfort but for a greater cause. This belief hardened into determination, and soon my thoughts and plans revolved around how to turn this knowledge into action. By the time I finished my training at ISH, I was not the same man who had entered its gates. My heart was filled with a sense of purpose that went beyond personal ambition. I spoke with confidence in gatherings, encouraged younger Muslims to stay strong in their faith, and reminded them that Islam was not meant to hide in the shadows but to stand in the light. People began to listen when I spoke, not just because I was successful in business, but because I spoke with the authority of someone trained in knowledge. This combination of wealth, recognition, and religious education gave me an influence I had never dreamed of. I felt unstoppable, convinced that nothing could stand in the way of Islam's progress in Europe. That stubbornness, which had once helped me survive, now became the driving force behind everything I did. My heart burned with desperation to see Islam dominate not just in small communities but across all of Europe. In my mind, the laws of France were temporary and flawed, while the Sharia was eternal and perfect. I became restless whenever I saw Muslims struggling to live according to their faith in a secular environment. To me, it was clear that the solution was not silence or compromise but a determined push for Sharia courts that would allow us to live fully under the law of Allah. The thought consumed me day and night, and I began searching for ways to make it a reality. My first steps were within the walls of mosques across Paris. I started to attend special gatherings where like-minded Muslims shared their frustrations with the French system. In those quiet corners, often after the evening prayers, we spoke about the need for our communities to have legal recognition under Sharia. Some of these discussions happened openly in the mosque halls, but many were held privately in homes where we could speak without fear of outsiders listening. I remember sitting on the floor with brothers from different backgrounds, Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, and Syrians like me, each one of us eager to see change. These meetings filled me with energy because I no longer felt alone in my desire. I realized that there were many others who shared the same dream, but they lacked someone willing to take bold steps to lead them. Slowly, I began to use my position as a respected business owner to build influence within these circles. People knew me as Abdul-Aziz, the restaurant owner who had succeeded in France while still holding firmly to Islam. When I spoke, they listened not just because of my words but because my success gave weight to them. I began to organize small gatherings in the back of my restaurant after hours. The same tables where people once ate shawarma and falafel now became places where we planned strategies for the future of Muslims in France. I provided food, offered my space, and sometimes gave money to support causes we believed in. My wealth was no longer just for my comfort. It became a tool for what I saw as the greater mission of Islam. The more I gave, the more respect I earned, and the deeper I was drawn into leadership. It wasn't long before I started to be invited into underground meetings with people I had never imagined I would meet. These gatherings were often in hidden places, basements of apartments, quiet back rooms in mosques, or even private homes where curtains were drawn tight. We sat in circles, discussing strategies about how to make the French government recognize Sharia courts for Muslims. Some of the men spoke of legal pathways, others of community pressure, and a few even whispered about stronger means of resistance if the system refused. I found myself caught between admiration and fear, but my desire to see Islam rise in Europe pushed me to listen and learn. In those rooms, surrounded by determined men, I felt part of something far greater than myself. It was no longer just a dream, it was becoming a movement. My influence grew as I began to contribute more than just words. I invested my own money into printing materials, organizing conferences, and supporting imams who were willing to stand up and speak about Sharia in their sermons. At first, these efforts were small, but little by little they began to gain attention. In certain neighborhoods, Muslims started to talk about the idea of a Sharia court as if it were possible, as if it were only a matter of time. I fueled that belief because I truly thought it was within reach. Each time someone thanked me for my efforts or asked me for guidance, I felt my determination grow stronger. I was no longer satisfied with running a restaurant. I wanted to leave a mark on the history of Muslims in France. Building networks became my main focus. I traveled across different parts of France, meeting community leaders, imams, and ordinary Muslims who were eager for change. In Lyon, I sat with groups of young men who wanted their marriages and disputes settled under Sharia instead of French law. In Marseille, I visited families who longed for recognition of their religious practices without interference. Everywhere I went, I found people who felt the same frustration I carried. I used these opportunities to build trust, reminding them that I was not just speaking empty words but investing my own wealth and reputation into the cause. Over time, I was seen as more than a businessman or a student of Islam. I became a leader, someone whose voice mattered in the push for change. The trust one gained came with responsibility. People began to look to me for direction, asking what steps to take next, how to approach politicians, and how to organize communities around this mission. I felt both honored and burdened, but I told myself that Allah had chosen me for this role. I encouraged Muslims to stand firm, to reject the idea of blending into French society without recognition, and to demand their rights as believers. I framed the Sharia court movement not just as a religious desire but as a matter of justice, equality, and dignity. This argument resonated with many, and soon our network stretched beyond Paris into other regions of France. I began to realize that what had started as private conversations was now becoming a structured campaign with me at its center. After gaining recognition in France, I began to feel that the mission could not remain within one country alone. The more meetings I attended and the more voices I heard, the more I became convinced that Muslims across Europe shared the same frustrations and desires. In my heart, I believed that if France could establish Sharia courts, then other nations would quickly follow. But why wait for France to act first? Why not build a movement that stretched beyond borders? This thought grew stronger each day until it became impossible to ignore. I told myself that Allah had given me influence not only for my local community but for the whole of Europe. I decided that the time had come to expand, to travel, and to spread the dream of Sharia courts across the continent. My first journey outside France for this mission was to the Netherlands. I had heard that the Muslim communities in Amsterdam and Rotterdam were strong, with many mosques and organizations that already had influence in Dutch society. When I arrived, I was welcomed by brothers who had been introduced to me through contacts I had made in Paris. We sat together in small apartments and mosque offices, drinking tea and speaking for hours about the struggles Muslims faced in the Netherlands. They told me about the challenges of integration, the pressures to abandon Islamic identity, and the discrimination they often experienced. I listened carefully, and then I spoke about the work we were doing in France, about the dream of Sharia courts, and about how it could be possible if we united. Their eyes lit up with interest, and I could see that the idea was planting seeds in their minds. In Amsterdam, I joined one particular meeting in a mosque basement that left a strong mark on me. The room was filled with young men, students, and workers, all eager to hear my story. I told them about how we had started with small gatherings in Paris, how we used our networks and resources, and how we began to shape the conversation about Sharia. I reminded them that the Netherlands, like France, had a large Muslim population that could no longer be ignored. If we pushed together, we could demand recognition. Their applause gave me confidence, and by the time I left, I had gained several new contacts who promised to spread the word further. In Rotterdam, I saw the same enthusiasm. Everywhere I went, I felt like the dream was growing bigger, stronger, and more real. After the Netherlands, my next destination was Spain. I traveled to Madrid and later to Barcelona, cities with long histories tied to Islam. For me, walking through Spain carried an emotional weight because I knew of Al-Andalus, the centuries when Islam thrived there before being defeated. I felt as though history was calling Muslims to rise again in that land. In Madrid, I met groups of Muslims from Morocco and other North African countries who shared their stories of struggle. They spoke of their desire to live freely as Muslims, without fear of judgment or pressure to conform. I spoke to them about the vision of Sharia courts, about how France and the Netherlands were already moving in that direction, and about how Spain could join this growing wave. Some were cautious, but others embraced the idea with passion, saying it was time for Muslims to stand proudly again in Europe. Barcelona was different but equally powerful. I was invited to a private meeting in the home of a respected Muslim family. The living room was filled with men and women who wanted to hear what I had to say. I shared my experiences, my training at ISH, and the progress we had made in France. I reminded them that Muslims had once ruled parts of Spain with dignity and justice, and that the legacy of Al-Andalus should not be forgotten. The reaction was emotional. Some people wept, saying they longed to see Islam rise again in Europe. I left Spain with a sense that the dream was spreading like fire. It was no longer just words spoken in Paris. It was becoming a vision shared in different corners of the continent. My third journey was to London, a city I had always admired for its diversity. London had one of the largest Muslim populations in Europe, and I knew that if the idea of Sharia courts could gain ground there, it would send shockwaves across the continent. When I arrived, I was surprised by the openness of the Muslim community. There were already organizations and leaders advocating for Islamic rights, and many were eager to hear from someone who was pushing the same agenda in France. I attended meetings in mosques in East London, where men gathered late into the night to discuss strategies. I also visited homes where families welcomed me warmly, serving food while we spoke about the dream of a united Islamic Europe. The passion I saw in London gave me hope that the vision was not only possible but inevitable if we remained committed. One particular event in London remains in my memory. I was invited to speak at a small community center, where about 50 people had gathered. I stood in front of them and shared how we were building momentum in France, how the Netherlands and Spain were joining the cause, and how London could be the heart of the movement. I spoke about unity, about courage, and about the need to act now rather than wait for others to decide our future. The room erupted in applause, and several young men approached me afterward, asking how they could help. I gave them guidance, shared contacts, and encouraged them to use their talents, whether in law, business, or media, to promote the vision. It was in that moment that I felt the movement had truly crossed borders and taken root in multiple nations. As I traveled between France, the Netherlands, Spain, and London, I began to see myself as more than just a businessman or community leader. I saw myself as part of a larger mission to unite Muslims across Europe under one goal: the establishment of Sharia courts. I believed that this was not just a political movement but a religious duty, a way to honor Allah by ensuring that His law was respected in the lands where we lived. The vision of a united Islamic Europe consumed me. Every conversation, every meeting, and every journey became another step toward that dream. I poured my wealth into travel, printing, and supporting others who shared the cause. I hardly thought about myself anymore. All I cared about was the mission. After my travels to the Netherlands, Spain, and London, I became convinced that the movement for Sharia courts had the potential to sweep across Europe. My name was already being whispered in gatherings beyond France, and I felt more determined than ever to push the campaign further. One evening, during a private meeting in Paris, a trusted brother told me about certain sects of Muslims in Ireland who were known for their strong commitment to the faith and their desire to preserve Islamic identity in the West. He explained that these groups were scattered across Dublin and Cork, and that they were waiting for someone to guide them with strategy and vision. His words stirred something deep in me. If I could connect with them, I thought we could expand the dream to another corner of Europe, and Ireland would become another voice in the chorus demanding Sharia courts. The thought of Ireland fascinated me. It was a country with its own long history of religion and resistance, and I felt that Muslims there would understand the struggle we were facing in France and beyond. For weeks, I exchanged messages with contacts who assured me that meetings could be arranged. They told me about small gatherings that already existed in mosques and in private homes, where men and women spoke quietly about their frustration at being forced to live entirely under secular law. They longed for recognition of their faith in a way that was not superficial, but deep and meaningful. I promised them that I would come, bringing not only my personal story but also strategies from France that could inspire them. In my heart, I believed Ireland would be another victory, another step toward a united Islamic Europe that I had begun to envision. With the decision made, I began preparing for the journey. I set aside money from my restaurant income to cover the trip, and I informed a few trusted brothers of my plans. They congratulated me, telling me that Allah had chosen me for this important task. I felt proud, confident, and eager to travel. I packed only what I needed, a small suitcase with clothes, notes, and documents that I thought would be useful for the meetings. My mind was full of excitement. I imagined myself arriving in Dublin, standing in front of eager Muslims, speaking with the same passion that had moved others in Amsterdam, Madrid, and London. I pictured the faces of young men nodding in agreement, women whispering prayers, and elders offering their blessings. The dream seemed so close, and I was ready to give myself completely to it. The journey began smoothly. I flew from Paris to Dublin on a gray morning, the kind of day where the clouds seemed to hang heavy in the sky. On the plane, I stared out of the window, lost in thought. My heart beat with anticipation as I imagined what awaited me. When the plane landed, I felt a rush of adrenaline, as if I was stepping onto sacred ground where history would be made. I checked into a modest hotel near the city center, and later that evening, I met with two brothers who had been introduced to me through my contacts in France. They welcomed me warmly, treating me as though I were already a leader they respected. Over tea, we spoke about the challenges they faced, and I encouraged them with stories of the growing movement elsewhere in Europe. Their enthusiasm gave me confidence that this trip would be a success. The following days were filled with planning. We arranged small meetings with different groups, and I prepared my speeches carefully. I wanted to inspire them not just with words, but with a clear vision of what could be achieved if they stood together. I walked through Dublin streets with my hosts, noticing the mix of old churches and modern buildings. Everywhere I went, I compared what I saw to the mission in my heart. I imagined mosques standing boldly in place of empty halls, and Sharia courts recognized alongside secular institutions. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Ireland could become a shining example for Muslims in other countries. It felt as if destiny had led me here, and I was determined not to waste the opportunity. But destiny had something else in store for me. On the third evening of my stay, after attending a private meeting in the suburbs of Dublin, I was being driven back to my hotel by one of the brothers. The night was cold and damp, with rain falling steadily onto the roads. The car moved quickly along a narrow stretch of highway, and though I felt tired, my mind was still racing with thoughts of the campaign. Suddenly, everything changed. Out of nowhere, another vehicle swerved into our lane, its headlights blinding us. I remember the driver shouting in panic, trying to turn the wheel, but there was no time. The collision was violent, the sound of metal crashing against metal filling my ears as the world around me spun out of control. The impact threw me forward, and in those seconds, it felt as though time slowed down. My body was shaken violently, and the glass shattered around me like rain. Pain shot through my chest and arms as the car twisted and finally came to a halt on its side. For a moment, there was silence except for the faint hiss of the engine and the sound of rain hitting the wreckage. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel blood trickling down my face. I tried to move, but every part of me ached with agony. The driver was unconscious, slumped over the wheel, and I realized how fragile life truly was. My thoughts of Sharia courts, of influence, and of leadership began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming fear of what was happening. As the pain grew worse, I felt myself slipping away. My vision blurred, and the sounds of the world became distant. I could hear faint voices shouting somewhere outside the car, but they seemed far away. My chest grew heavy, and every breath felt like a battle I was losing. In those moments, I realized that death was not just a distant idea but a reality standing before me. My heart pounded, then slowed, and I felt my body becoming weaker. I remember whispering Allah under my breath, but the word felt empty, powerless, as though it could not save me. Then, in an instant, everything went dark. The pain was gone, the sound of rain was gone, and I crossed into a place I had never imagined I would see with my own eyes. The moment I crossed into death was unlike anything I could have prepared for. I had always thought that dying would be quiet, that it would feel like falling asleep. Instead, it was sudden and overwhelming. One moment, I was trapped in a broken car, gasping for air, and the next, I was standing in complete darkness, separated from the world I had known. My body was no longer broken, yet I felt naked, exposed, and terrified. There was no comfort, no warmth, only a strange emptiness that chilled me to my core. I tried to call out, but no sound came from my mouth. It was then that I realized I had left life behind, and whatever lay ahead was beyond my control. The journey I had begun for Sharia courts in Ireland had ended on that road, but a new journey, one I had never expected, was only beginning. The moment everything went dark after the crash, I thought perhaps I was simply unconscious, but very quickly I realized that this was something entirely different. I was no longer in the broken car, and I was not lying on the cold, wet road. Instead, I found myself standing in a strange emptiness, a place where there was no sky, no ground I could truly feel beneath me, and no air to breathe. At first, there was only silence, but then I began to hear faint cries, distant at first, but slowly growing louder until they surrounded me. My body felt weightless, yet my soul felt heavier than it ever had. I tried to move, but with every step I took, the darkness seemed to swallow me deeper. My heart pounded in confusion as I began to understand that I had crossed beyond life, and that whatever was happening was far more real than the world I had left behind. Suddenly, the darkness gave way to a light, but it was not the warm light I had always imagined death would bring. Instead, it was a flickering, fiery glow that burned my eyes and filled me with dread. The cries grew louder, and I soon realized they were screams of pain, desperate and endless. My body was pulled forward against my will, and within moments, I stood before a vast pit of fire. The flames rose higher than buildings, swirling like waves, consuming everything within them. The heat struck me with such force that I felt my skin burning even before I entered. I tried to resist, but it was as though invisible hands dragged me closer until I was thrown into the fire itself. Instantly, my body ignited with pain. My skin sizzled, my flesh burned, and yet I did not die. I felt every sensation multiplied, and I knew this was not the pain of the body but of the soul. As I screamed in agony, I looked around and realized I was not alone. All around me were faces I recognized, faces of people I had once respected, trusted, and even followed. There were imams whose sermons I had listened to, clerics whose words had fueled my determination, and friends with whom I had sat in secret meetings planning for Sharia in Europe. They were all there, writhing in the flames, their mouths open in endless screams, their eyes wide with terror. Some called out the name of Allah, but their cries only echoed back in despair. Others cursed their fate, clawing at the fire as though they could escape, but there was no escape. Their robes and turbans burned away, their skin blackened, and yet their torment never ended. My heart twisted as I realized that these were the very people I had admired, the ones I had believed were walking in the truth. The shock of seeing them in that condition overwhelmed me. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that perhaps this was some kind of illusion, but every detail was too sharp, too real. I remembered their voices in the mosques, their encouragement during our campaigns, their pride in pushing Islam in Europe. Now all of that was gone, replaced by screams that would never cease. I saw one of my closest friends, a brother I had traveled with to meetings in Lyon, his face melted by the fire, his hands reaching out as though begging me for help. But I could do nothing. His cries pierced me deeper than the flames ever could. I shouted back at him, calling his name, but he only screamed louder, his voice lost in the chaos around us. The fire united us, not in brotherhood, but in suffering. The flames continued to consume me, and the agony grew unbearable. Every moment felt like an eternity, and yet I knew time had no meaning in this place. My body burned, but it never turned to ash. My skin peeled, but it never disappeared. The torment was designed to continue without end. I began to panic, realizing that if this was my destiny, I would never escape. I cried out desperately, "Allah, save me!" But there was no answer, no comfort, no mercy. Instead, the fire seemed to grow hotter with each plea. The imams and clerics around me screamed the same, calling on Allah, but their voices were met with the same silence. In that moment, I understood a terrifying truth. We had been deceived. What we thought was righteousness had led us here, and now there was no way back. Then, through the roar of the flames and the endless screams, a voice thundered across the pit. It was unlike any voice I had ever heard before, loud, powerful, filled with authority that shook the very ground beneath the fire. It was not a voice of anger alone, but of judgment, final and absolute. The sound pierced through my burning soul, and I trembled as I listened. The voice said, "This is the place prepared for those who reject my Son, Jesus Christ. This is where you are coming if you do not turn away from your ways." The word struck me like lightning. I had expected to hear Arabic, perhaps even verses of the Quran, but instead I heard truth that I could not deny. It was not the God I had thought I served speaking. It was a voice greater, stronger, and undeniable. Fear gripped me as the voice continued, echoing over the flames, reminding me that my plans to turn Europe into an Islamic continent were paths that led directly to this fire. I thought of the meetings, the travels, the speeches I had given, and suddenly they seemed like chains dragging me deeper into the pit. The voice was clear. If I continued, this would be my eternal home. My heart pounded with terror as I looked around at the burning faces of those who had walked the same path I was walking. Their cries were a living warning to me, a vision of what awaited if I did not change. I wanted to close my eyes and escape, but there was no escape. The truth surrounded me, undeniable and terrifying. In that moment, the fire roared louder as though it wanted to swallow me whole, but suddenly everything shifted. The flames disappeared, the screams faded, and I felt myself being pulled upward with great force. My body trembled as if it were being torn apart, and then I opened my eyes to the sight of white hospital lights above me. I gasped for air, coughing violently as though I had been underwater for hours. My chest heaved and tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. Doctors and nurses rushed to my side, shouting in panic. I could hear one of them saying, "He's back. He's alive." Their voices were full of disbelief, and I realized I had returned to life. The contrast between the fire of hell and the cold hospital room was overwhelming, and I wept like a child, unable to stop. The staff surrounded me, trying to calm me down, but my screams filled the room. I shouted, "Fire! Fire! They are burning!" My words made little sense to them, but I could not stop. My body shook as I remembered every detail of what I had seen. Nurses tried to hold me down gently, while a doctor asked me to breathe slowly. Their eyes showed confusion, fear, and even curiosity as they wondered what I had experienced. To them, I was simply a man who had survived a terrible accident, but to me, I was a man who had walked into hell itself. My tears would not stop, and I covered my face with my hands, ashamed of the path I had chosen and terrified of where it had almost led me. That hospital room became the place where my old life ended, and my new life truly began. When I finally left the hospital in Ireland, I was not the same man who had arrived days earlier. The accident had nearly taken my life, but it was the glimpse of hell that had shaken me to my core. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the flames, hear the screams of my friends and mentors, and feel the voice thundering across the fire, warning me of my destiny. My body was weak, covered with bruises and scars, but the deeper wounds were inside me. I was terrified to sleep, terrified to be alone, terrified of what would happen if I returned to my old path. My hosts in Dublin urged me to rest, but I knew I had to leave. I wanted nothing more than to return to France, the country where my journey had begun, and figure out what to do with the new truth I had been given. The flight back to Paris felt longer than any I had ever taken. I sat in silence, staring out the window, replaying the scenes of hell again and again in my mind. I could not shake the faces I had seen in the fire, the imams and clerics who had once inspired me, the friends I had traveled with, all burning endlessly. The memory broke me each time, and I would wipe away tears before the flight attendants noticed. When the plane landed at Charles de Gaulle, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I was back in familiar surroundings, but everything felt different. The streets of Paris that had once inspired me with energy now felt empty. The restaurant that had once been my pride now felt like a chain pulling me back into the life I wanted to escape. I knew I had to make drastic decisions if I was going to survive spiritually. The first step was to close my restaurant. It was not an easy decision because the restaurant had been my foundation in France, the place where I had built my reputation and gathered respect. But I could no longer walk through its doors without remembering the secret meetings I had hosted in its back rooms. Every table reminded me of conversations about spreading Sharia across Europe. Every corner reminded me of plans that now felt like poison. I gathered my staff together, thanked them for their years of service, and told them I could not continue. Some were shocked, others confused, but I did not offer detailed explanations. I simply said that I needed to step away, that life had shown me a different path. Closing those doors was painful, but it was also liberating. It was my way of breaking the first chain that tied me to my old life. After shutting down the restaurant, I began to cut ties with the networks I had built. This was even harder than closing a business because it meant turning my back on people who had once trusted me as a leader. I stopped attending the underground meetings, stopped answering calls from those who wanted updates, and distanced myself from friends who still clung to the same dreams. Some of them grew suspicious, wondering why I had disappeared so suddenly. Others accused me of betrayal, sending harsh words that cut deep. But I could not explain to them the truth of what I had seen, because I knew they would mock me or reject me outright. I carried the secret of hell inside me, and I knew I could not share it with men who were still blind to the danger. Cutting those ties hurt, but it gave me the freedom to breathe again. Even with those ties cut, I still felt unsafe in Paris. The city was full of people who knew me, who had once followed my lead, and I feared they would come looking for me. I needed distance, a place where I could live quietly and think deeply without the noise of old networks around me. That was when I decided to move to Massif Central in the Auvergne region. It was far from the busy life of Paris, isolated, and surrounded by mountains and open land. To many it seemed like a strange choice, but to me it was perfect. I wanted to hide away from the world, to escape the temptations and pressures of my old life. The peace of the countryside gave me space to heal, to reflect, and to search for the God who had spoken to me in the fire. Living in Massif Central was a completely different experience from anything I had known. The air was fresh, the nights were quiet, and the people were distant but polite. For the first time in years, I was not surrounded by crowds of Muslims asking for direction or supporters waiting for instructions. I lived simply, cooking for myself, reading and taking long walks in the countryside. It was in that silence that I began to feel something stir inside me. I remembered the voice I had heard in hell, the one that told me this was my destiny if I did not change. I could not escape those words, and slowly I began to realize that the voice was not condemning me alone. It was offering me a chance to turn back. For the first time in my life, I opened my heart to the possibility that Jesus was truly who he said he was. I had grown up hearing about Isa in the Quran, but in Islam, Jesus was never the Son of God, never the Savior of the world. Yet the voice in hell had spoken with authority, declaring him as the Son who had been rejected. I began to search quietly, reading parts of the Bible that I could find online. The words pierced me in ways the Quran never had. When I read John 14 verse 6, where Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me," I felt as though the words were written directly for me. For weeks, I wrestled with fear and confusion, but eventually I reached the point of surrender. One evening in my small home in Auvergne, I knelt down on the floor and whispered a prayer that changed my life. I told Jesus I was ready to follow him, ready to leave behind the chains of my past. The moment I prayed that prayer, I felt something break inside me. It was as though the heaviness I had carried for years, the guilt, the anger, the fear, lifted away. For the first time since the accident, I felt peace. It was not the false confidence I once carried in meetings or the pride I felt in leading campaigns. It was a deep, quiet peace that filled my soul. I wept for hours, thanking Jesus for saving me, for giving me another chance, for pulling me out of the fire before it was too late. From that day forward, I knew my identity was no longer Abdul-Aziz the activist or the businessman. I was now a follower of Christ, a man redeemed from darkness and given a new life. My past no longer defined me, my future was in his hands. As I lived quietly in Massif Central, I began to rebuild my life with this new identity. I spent time reading the Bible, praying, and slowly connecting with small Christian groups in the region. They welcomed me with kindness, even though I carried a past that was heavy with mistakes. I did not tell them everything at first, but they could see the change in me. Over time, I shared parts of my story and they prayed with me, encouraging me to keep walking in faith. The isolation that once felt like hiding now became a gift, a chance to grow roots in Christ without distraction. Each day I woke up grateful for the second chance I had been given, knowing that I could have easily been lost forever in the fire I had seen. For many months, I kept my story to myself. I was afraid of what people would say, afraid of being rejected by old friends, and even afraid of being questioned by Christians who might doubt me. But as time passed, I realized that my story was not mine to keep. The voice I heard in hell had not only warned me but also rescued me, and I could not remain silent about that. I thought of the countless Muslims still walking the path I once walked, blind to the truth, and my heart ached for them. I thought of Christians who doubted the power of Jesus to save, and I wanted to encourage them. I decided that I needed to share my testimony, not to glorify myself, but to glorify the one who had saved me from destruction. That is why I am telling my story now. I want people to understand that I was once fully committed to Islam, desperate for Sharia courts across Europe, and convinced that I was doing the will of God. But I was wrong. I was blind, deceived, and walking toward destruction. It took a near-death experience and a vision of hell to wake me up, but Jesus reached into that fire and pulled me out. As I close my story, I want to speak directly to you, the one listening or reading these words. Do not take this testimony lightly. What I experienced was not a dream, not a vision born from imagination, but a reality that shook my entire life. I stood at the edge of eternity, I felt the flames of hell, I heard the screams of those who are trapped there forever. And I tell you now, with all the seriousness of my heart, hell is real. It is not a story told to frighten children, it is not a myth invented by religions. I saw it, I felt it, and I cannot keep silent. My charge to you is simple. Believe this testimony and act upon it before it is too late. To the Muslims who may hear my words, I plead with you from the depths of my soul. I once walked the same path you are walking. I prayed the prayers, I fasted, I studied, I fought to defend Islam with my voice and my resources. I believed with all my heart that I was on the side of truth. Yet I saw imams, clerics, mentors, men I respected and followed, burning in the fire of hell. Their titles did not save them, their knowledge did not save them, their zeal did not save them. They are rotting away in endless torment, and if you follow their path, you will join them. The only way not to land there is to give your life to Jesus, the Son of God, who alone has the power to save. To the unbelievers, those who reject God completely or live as though he does not matter, I also speak to you. You may think that life is about pleasure, money, fame, or knowledge, but all of these end at the grave. I saw people who were once great in this world, people who were admired, powerful, and respected. Yet in hell their greatness meant nothing. Their voices were reduced to screams, their pride turned to dust, and their legacies forgotten. Do not be deceived by the temporary lights of this world. Do not believe the lie that you can live without God and escape judgment. Hell is full of those who thought the same, and now they know the truth too late. You still have a chance, but only if you turn to Jesus Christ today. And to the believers in Christ, I say this with love and urgency. Take your faith seriously. Do not play with sin, do not compromise, do not live half-heartedly. Hell is not only for the obviously wicked, it is for all who reject the salvation of Christ and choose their own way. I met men in the fire who once appeared holy in the eyes of others. But God cannot be deceived. If you truly belong to Jesus, live like it. Share His message, walk in His truth, and do not be silent while others around you walk blindly into destruction. My testimony is not just a warning for unbelievers. It is also a wake-up call for Christians to live faithfully, boldly, and without shame. I speak with urgency because I know the danger of delay. Some of you may hear this testimony and think, I will consider it later. I will decide when I am older. I will choose Jesus someday. Do not be fooled. You do not control your tomorrow. I thought I had many years ahead of me, yet in one moment on a rainy road in Dublin, I stood at the edge of hell. Death can come suddenly without warning, and if it finds you without Christ, you will face the fire I saw. Do not wait. Do not gamble with your soul. Eternity is real, and your choice today determines where you will spend it. I beg you to see the seriousness of this truth. Hell is not a place of jokes or second chances. It is a place of endless fire, endless regret, endless separation from God. The cries I heard still echo in my ears, and I would not wish them on my worst enemy. Jesus Christ came so that none of us would have to go there. He died on the cross, taking the punishment for our sins, and rose again so that we could have life. He offers forgiveness, peace, and eternal joy to anyone who calls on His name. Not to some, not to a few, but to everyone who believes. That includes you, no matter who you are or what you have done. So I leave you with this charge. Take my testimony seriously. Believe that what I saw is real. Do not follow the path of religion without salvation. Do not trust in mentors or leaders who themselves are blind, and do not waste your life chasing things that end at the grave. Give your life to Jesus today. Confess your sins, surrender your heart, and accept Him as your Lord and Savior. Hell is real, but heaven is also real, and through Christ you can choose life instead of death. This is my story, but it can also be your warning. I escaped the fire by the mercy of God, and I am here to tell you that you can too. Choose Jesus while there is still time.